Thank you. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you guys today, especially about, this session supposed to be population explosion or population warning. And I'm actually going to talk to you about vulnerable populations and planning for those parts of your community, as instead of looking at the community just as simply as a whole, as one entity, actually diving a bit deeper and looking at who actually makes up that whole, because their unique needs need to be taken into account in emergency planning. So I'm going to share my screen a bit. All right, and then get into it. So I am from Catholic Charities USA, but a little bit about me. I have been in humanitarian assistance field since I graduated from college in 2003, and I started internationally. I worked for the Imara Foundation, which does medicine and medical supplies worldwide. We work with in-country partners. I was lucky to get my foot in the door there. From your professor told me how a lot of you are seniors and trying to think where your next steps are. I remember that. I remember looking around and thinking, I knew I wanted to do humanitarian assistance. I wasn't sure how. Most aid agencies, you need your master's degree to answer the phone. Like, it was really tough to get into sometimes. So I was just really lucky to get an interview. At the same time, I was halfway through Peace Corps interview process. So it was just really lucky. I started out as the travel coordinator and administrative assistants for the VPs of international programming. And my parents were very funny about it. They just said, be a sponge. And I was. I took in as much info as I could. And a year later, they gave me an associate position in emergency response, and kind of haven't looked back since. I really appreciated that time. I then got my master's in disaster management and sustainable development from University of Northumbria which is in Newcastle, England. It's a pretty international program. It was great to kind of step back out of the international world and just really think about concepts, and versus just doing response and recovery and ongoing programming, to really step back and think why we do things in a certain way. That program in particular looks at the correlation between your immediate response needs and then your ongoing development. There is, in the US, as well as very much internationally, a break in between how we respond and how that affects our ongoing recovery efforts, or internationally, the sustainable development efforts. That handoff between either OCHA or UNHCR to UNDP can be really a messy process sometimes. And so we looked at how do you take response planning and activities and make it so that they can be sustainable into the recovery phase. And that's something too domestically we look at all the time. There's a lot of agencies who are really well known, but they are response agencies. They're not recovery. And a lot of times you have the agencies who are there throughout, who kind of trying to lead the charge in terms of ensuring that the population can be resilient. They can bounce back from a disaster. So taking that whole disaster cycle into account, not just response and recovery, and not just response or just recovery, but looking at the whole process. So that's something I'll talk about a little bit today. But I've been focused on domestic disasters since 2009, and took a couple of years off, had a baby, and decided it was a good time to have a break. This work can get very draining sometimes, and sometimes you just need to step back because it's, disaster after disaster, or it can wear you after a while. But I came back last summer excited, ready to really share everything I had learned, and a whole new perspective now too with being a mom. And I was very lucky CCSA had the opening and invited me to come back. And I've been with them. I had been with them since 2012, and took a few years off and back, and just really focused now on partnerships and working with none of this gets done without partners. None of our emergency response work or recovery at all especially recovery. We really rely on each other in the humanitarian and the disaster relief field. One agency takes one aspect, and the house doesn't get built by one group or rebuilt. It is 5 different groups working together. We often are the ones with the finances, so we're able to pay for the materials, but the Mennonite disaster assistance will come in and they will build, or volunteers will be supplied through a different group. It's those relationships are really key. So I'm happy to be able to manage those. And I work internally with our staff on advocacy efforts and communications, and we have a huge grant program. And I have to read every one of the reports and see what's going on with them. So it's busy, but this is a pretty rewarding career if this is the way you choose to go. With that, let's see if I can change my. So again, my name is Kathleen Oldaker, and my official title is the Senior Director of Disaster Strategy and Grants Oversight. I've got about 2 halves to my job. One is the disaster side. The other half, I work on our just compliance and oversight measures for all of the federal, or what we call national intermediary grants. So grants that we have from larger foundations or from federal agencies that we then subgrant to our members. This just give a little perspective. So this is 1 year worth of severe weather reports and what it looks like in the US. For each little dot could be one community that was affected, and it might not have made national news, might not even have made their state news, but for that community, that's a disaster. And we literally go to that level. It's not directly, we work through our member agencies, but it's disaster work. You really need to look at it both in the micro as well as the macro, and thinking of how many events just this country looks at. If you look at it on a global scale, it's pretty overwhelming. So a little bit about CCSA, talking about vulnerable populations, how to include vulnerable populations really in your planning. Who do you talk to? What tools do you use? Why is this important? And then with the whole task force looking at Tonga and the volcanic eruption, I want to look at Tonga itself and kind of think how would that be affected by not only the volcanic eruption, but also ensuing tsunamis and things like that. So Catholic Charities USA, or CCUSA, is our shorthand. We are a member organization. We were founded in 1910 as the National Conference of Catholic Charities, changed our name, I think, in the 80s. Catholic Charities has existed much longer than that, especially in the US, back into the 1800s. And each agency is its own agency, own independent member. Some are part of their Catholic diocese, some are independent of their diocese. They're all unique. And we have 167 of them that we have to keep track of. They stretch across all of the US and the US territories. So 50 states plus DC, US Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Guam, American Samoa, and Saipan. So it's not one size fits all for any sort of planning that we do. We train them in the basics. We can train them in some deeper concepts, but we also try to connect in disasters with their everyday programming. So you see here our strategic priorities. Really, we're looking at reducing poverty. Our typical clients are the impoverished, those who need help on a daily basis. So whether it's affordable housing, whether it's immigration and refugee services, something we've really has gotten a lot of attention recently. We have agencies who are relied upon along the border, the southern border, and they're relied upon by Customs and Border Patrol to provide humanitarian services. Customs and Border Patrol aren't the ones that don't want to feed everybody or house everyone as they come across the border, as they're cleared to enter the US. It's a very specific, once they're cleared to come in, a lot of times CBP will be dropping off people at Catholic Charities agencies. So it's on us to take care of them and make sure they go to their next destination okay. Also with refugee services, looking at central Missouri is Catholic Charities of Central and Northern Missouri. has been resettling a couple hundred Afghan refugees since the evacuation. You might not have heard about it, but they're there. They're working really closely with local population. I know they worked with AmeriCorps and had what's called an NCCC team come in, the National Civilian Conservation Corps. So your year of service with AmeriCorps, that NCCC members coming to help with getting homes ready, getting apartments set up and cleaned and ready for all these families coming in. That's a huge influx to a resettlement agency who maybe work with a family a month, let alone a couple hundred in 3 to 6 months. It's pretty huge. We also look at health, nutrition, social enterprise, which is creating opportunities to fund your social services. So some sort of profit making that could then fund your actual social service entity. Advocacy, we do a lot of work with Capitol Hill and promoting policies that will help the poor. Development, raising funds for our agencies, and then disaster. Disaster, the big focus started in 1990 for the US Conference of Catholic Bishops, there's USCCB. They're our governing body of the Catholic Church in the US. They kind of pointed the finger at CCSA and said, you're in charge of domestic disaster response. And it doesn't matter if they're a member of CCSA or not. There's about 10 to 20 dioceses that aren't involved with CCSA, but our disaster office still supports them. We do training at that level. We do granting at that level, whatever they need us to do. And in that, my VP, who is my director, I directly report to her, she was nominated or appointed by USCCB to be on the Federal Department of Homeland Security Faith-Based Advisory Committee. And that was started under President Obama. Tapered off a bit, it's coming back on since. But under that, it was a lot of different faith-based groups coming together to talk about mostly security issues within churches and to kind of share our experiences. We're the only disaster group that was involved, so we had a different take on it. But I had the opportunity as her alternate to participate in meetings and also participate in some of the committee efforts. And one of those was looking at the national preparedness grants. And most of those are from local municipalities. And after about a day and a half of reviewing them, realized they were all focused on infrastructure. And for preparedness, it was all about how many police cars you had, what your early warning system looked like, training for your fire and police. It had absolutely nothing to do with preparing your people. And you can be as prepared as you want to be in terms of your emergency managers, in terms of your actual governing structure. But none of that matters if your people don't know what to do. If they have no idea what the blue or the purple evacuation route even means and where it goes, or how they're going to get out of their house, who they're supposed to follow. If all you tell anyone is, hey, here's the siren. Well, what does that siren mean compared to another siren? Is that a fire siren? Is it a tornado siren? If you tell them watch TV, often the cable is the first thing to go out in a flood. Listen to the radio. What if you don't have, what if your electricity goes out and you don't have either battery operated or crank radio? Most of the US doesn't. How do we still get information to people unless they know how to access it beforehand? And that also plays into your community's resiliency. That if response doesn't work very well, how's recovery going to work? How do people know where to go to seek assistance for recovery? And then it also then flows into mitigation. Why should I lift my house? Why should I have roof tie downs? Things like that. It's just that communication piece wasn't there. When I voiced it to the committee, they all looked at me and went, we never even thought about it. So that's a problem. If these emergency managers aren't even looking at, they look at the population as an entity, they might look at adults and children, but they're not actually looking to who is in there. Disabled, elderly, how young are those children? All these different groups and how we look at it. And I think that really hit me being part of that committee and saying there's this huge disconnect between infrastructure and people, and that those need to come together. So that is my plea as future emergency managers or current, to not have that disconnect, to don't plan for your community, plan with them. Bring them around the table and actually start thinking, does all this planning or do all these plans that already exist make sense for that particular community that you're planning for? So disaster operations today, I mentioned this a little bit. We are in the community for the life of the community. That's kind of our motto. We're not one of those groups that you see just show up, lots of colorful shirts and lots of trucks and things like that, and then they leave when the disaster's over. We're there the whole time. And we're often some of the last ones at the table in terms of like unmet needs committee and long-term recovery groups. We do a lot in response, but most of our work, I would say, is on ongoing recovery. In preparedness, we look at annual training called the Applied Institute for Disaster Excellence. I was just in Louisiana getting ready for it. It's next December, but it is about 200 people typically come from across the country. We do capacity building at local agencies. How do you integrate disaster services into your ongoing work? In response, just in 2021, we had 48 individual agencies that responded to 75 disasters. The number doesn't match very well, 18 states. It depends on the state, but there are multiple agencies per state. They're basically at the diocesan level. And the dioceses are created typically by Catholic population. So New Jersey has 5 dioceses in a small state. There's a large Catholic population versus like Arkansas, 1 diocese, not a very big. It covers the entire state. So it's not a very big Catholic population. So it varies. This individual stat though, 48 agencies, 75 disasters. 1 agency dealt with 7 wildfires last year, individual wildfires. So they have to respond actually to each one individually as well, because federal funds and even some state funds come down for response and recovery by the individual disaster. So we also provide grants to them by individual disaster as well, so it helps them with their tracking. Recovery. We are known for disaster case management, which is walking the individual client to recovery. Case management itself is with what social workers do when a client walks in the door and says, I need help with a rent payment. They'll talk to them and be like, well, why do you need help with the rent payment? And are you underemployed, unemployed? What other services do you need? That's case management. So kind of looking at the whole person. Disaster case management, we look at it from a disaster's perspective. How did the disaster affect them? And what do they need to reach recovered state? And the recovered state might not be a lot better than it was previously. And if they need to be referred into ongoing case management services, we then can get them to that point as well. So we're known for that. And then financial assistance. We are very lucky with our donors. We're very lucky with being connected to our churches. There are 17,000 Catholic churches in the US. And big disasters, they often give from the pews, and eventually that money will come to us, and we'll be able to grant it out to local agencies for recovery. And then mitigation, do a lot of advocacy. We do a lot with rebuilds and repairs, lifting the houses in flood zones. Roof tie downs I mentioned before. In the case of Hurricane Ida, outside of Houma, Louisiana, 1 neighborhood, all the houses went down on this one street. The only house that actually took advantage of the state program to tie down the roof, it's the only one that still had their roof after Hurricane Ida. So mitigation does work. You just need to educate people on why it's important. And then neighborhood storm shelters. That's something really big in tornado areas, is to not just rely on individual basements, and a lot of homes don't have it. Look at mobile home parks and the necessity to have some sort of neighborhood in-ground storm shelter that people can go into and save lives. And then finally, our grant program that I mentioned earlier. So we do 3 types of grants: immediate media assistance, quick disaster, $10,000, and agencies spend it generally very, very quickly helping people with food and gift cards and things like that. We have initial recovery funding through our donors, and then we have long-term recovery. Oldest long-term recovery that we have right now on the books is the Joplin tornado from 2011. When the money just keeps coming for an individual event, we'll keep on the recovery as long as we can, as long as there's a reason to. In Joplin, they're currently doing a social enterprise program funded through disaster to keep training programs going, and construction and mitigation techniques and things like that. It's pretty cool. Let's see. So looking at vulnerable populations, the IFRC, or International Federation of Red Cross, defines vulnerable populations as those with the diminished capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from the impact of a natural or man-made hazard. But I look at it as, if it's someone who isn't able to just hop in a car and go, who has existing needs, who might not have that car to hop into and go, or who has someone that needs assistance, or who are generally the population that ends up in your shelters, your community shelters during a disaster, you have to start looking at why do they end up there. So children and the elderly, you'll hear a lot about under 5s and over 65s. So those are the populations who need additional assistance. Under 5s can't take care of themselves. Over 65s often have additional medical needs, mobility assistance issues that you have to specifically plan for that. The disabled, physical handicaps. Does that home have a vehicle that could evacuate the handicapped individual with it? Or do they rely on community handicapped vans to travel to medical appointments or around town? Some families with handicapped children rely on those school buses that have the ramps. What if they don't have a vehicle? Those are really expensive. What if they don't have a vehicle that can actually move that handicapped family member out of the house so they all can evacuate together? Communications challenges. Siren going off isn't helpful for those with hearing issues, impairments. Only putting something as a scroll, as a warning, as the scroll at the bottom of the screen, you're blind, you're not going to see it. Trying to think of having warnings in multiple ways, or multiple access points, so that those with those sorts of communication challenges or some sort of handicap can also access. Also cognitive impairment. What if they are anyone who needs additional assistance really to function? Those are the people we're also looking at. Migrants, refugees, and immigrants. A lot of times emergency planners look at the population as a whole and forget certain sections, especially of California, huge migrant farm worker populations. What are the languages that they actually speak? Do they read English? Do they speak English? And can they understand it? Are they speaking? And the knee-jerk reaction to that is put everything in Spanish too. It doesn't work. A lot of those populations too come from indigenous communities, which is a mixture of languages where they can kind of understand Spanish. They might be able to speak it a little bit, they can't read it, or they could be illiterate. Or you're also looking, there's also a wider migrant group too, the Haitians. So looking at Creole. Somali is another one with the refugee population, putting things in Somali, but also Arabic. So that knee-jerk reaction of just, oh, we'll just put everything in Spanish too, doesn't actually work. Refugee populations, knowing who's, like I mentioned before, central northern Missouri, getting a lot of Afghan refugees being resettled in the area. A lot of them actually don't speak Arabic either. What they speak is Pashto or Dari. A big portion of them are actually illiterate. They're from rural areas. They were helping US troops in those rural tribal areas, but maybe one of them within the whole family actually speaks English or can read and write. So trying to help putting information maybe in more pictorial. So pictograms of how you want people to, where to go, how to respond, what to do in terms of a flood. If it's just in writing in English, it's not going to be helpful for everyone. So having some pictures is usually helpful. A video is huge because they can watch, learn. If it's got a scroll, someone might be able to translate that for them. So just different ways of looking at preparing your population and then overall in the population. The homebound, anyone who is unable to leave their home on their own. Mostly medical homebound, but a lot of your senior population who just don't have a car anymore, can't afford it, aren't able to drive. How can they evacuate or respond to a disaster if they're stuck in place? One story I can share with that is 2012, Central Colorado, so Colorado Springs. Wildfires came down through the mountains and into certain areas of the city. The wildfire was coming down the mountain into this one neighborhood. They were told to get out. The police were at each intersection were using bullhorns to kind of go up into the upper levels of each street and telling them, pack now, get out, fire's on its way, you have to leave. And a couple houses got out, they were putting everything in the car and they realized there was no activity next door. And it hit them. There was an elderly couple, she's homebound. The only car they had was a sedan that it would not, he was physically unable to get her into that car. The two of the men across, who lived next door and across the street, knocked on the door to see what was going on. And the elderly man had managed to get his wife into a wheelchair, but then realized he couldn't get her down the mountain fast enough. He was afraid of trying to walk and losing control. He himself used a cane. How are they actually going to get out? And they had resigned themselves that they weren't. They were staying put, and they were prepared for that. The neighbors would not let them, wouldn't even think of it. So the two men picked up the woman in that heavy wheelchair and they carried her down until they found a cop. And they managed to get her into the cop car. They managed to get him with her and they were safe. That neighborhood's gone. They would have perished with it. But the only reason anyone knew they were there is because the neighbors did it. No one in emergency planning knew somebody was homebound or had any idea of who do you call to find the homebound? How do you get them out? Should they have gotten out earlier? Especially with wildfires, you never know because the wind will change the direction the wildfire are going. But thank God for their neighbors, or else they wouldn't be here anymore. So taking homebound into account. Transportation challenges, huge, especially in urban areas. Hurricane Sandy pretty much shut down New York City. People didn't know where to go, how to get out. Subways are flooded. But if you rely on a subway or a cab to get anywhere and you're in a high rise that doesn't have any electricity, how are you getting anywhere? You better hope that you're able to walk if you need to go to find a grocery store, or hope that you have extra food at home. What the Red Cross did is they used local university sports teams and they had them run up the high rises with food boxes to anyone that they knew was homebound. They had got a list. used a lot of building superintendents and things like that. They worked with the visiting nurse service. They worked with Meals on Wheels, and they figured out, gave a list, and they were running food up and down the stairs. Gave them exercise, but actually it was the only way they could think of actually getting meals up there. So that partnership piece. What if it's more of a rural area or New Orleans? We always look at that as an evacuation example. It gets hit frequently by hurricanes, and we know it coming. So coming ahead of time, you see the wave of people leaving. Well, what if you rely on public transportation? It gets shut down, and there's only one spot in the city, say the stadium, where buses, for those who don't have any cars or transportation, if there's only one spot in the city for people to go to and leave from, well, how do they get there? What if they're carrying kids and bags and pushing a stroller? How do they actually get to that point so that they can get out? Because they don't have their own transportation to begin with. And then you're, again, poor and homeless, which fills in a lot of these categories as well. They're all kind of interconnected. About 10 years ago, a study was done, and it's escaping me who exactly did it, but the statistic that came out was that it would cost a family of 4 who evacuated for 3 days $1,000. And most of our population don't have that $1,000 just sitting in savings. We have a large population who are paycheck to paycheck, or they're living on food stamps, or if they're out of work, they're not going to be able to feed their family. For them to actually evacuate, and it cost that much, that was 10 years ago. That number's increased since then. For a family of 4 for 3 days. Most disasters, you're actually going to evacuate for up to 2 weeks. Where do you go and what do you do? A lot of times they end up on our doorstep and say, can I have a hotel voucher? And I'm from, fill it in, and this is where we evacuated from. So we're trying to think about this ahead of time so that be prepared for helping that population. What about homeless? A lot of people have problems with, if you have to evacuate and you're on the bus with a huge homeless population, they get nervous about it. Not that there should be or shouldn't be issues, but it's just a reality of what we face. Having a family next to the homeless within a shelter can sometimes be really tense for the shelter managers and having to deal with. They're like, oh, kids don't understand why that person has everything in a bag, or they haven't showered in a while, or the homeless themselves often have a hard time understanding that those emergency shelters are also open for them, because they feel like they shouldn't be included in that population, or that they're not allowed to be included in that population. So planning for them as well, you don't just leave people behind. And then one other thing to look at, which I forgot to mention with migrants and refugees, are the undocumented often don't like to self-identify. So they won't go to shelters, even if they need to, because they're worried that ICE is at the shelters. As many times we've seen, nope, not happening. They're not. This is for you. This is to take care of you for safety. Won't go. They'll actually a lot will go to Catholic Church or any sort of church and seek help that way. So you have a lot of education for those groups and understanding that it is okay to seek out assistance. It's something we've had to do a lot with the refugee population coming from Afghanistan, explaining what 911 is, and it's okay to call 911 for a medical emergency or a kitchen fire or something like that. We do invite our authorities into the homes to help us. It's a foreign concept for especially groups that were in war-torn countries to want to invite your government into your door. You do everything you can to keep them out. And so some things that we would take advantage as Americans, just that 911 system, we've had to educate and explain that it's okay to use it. So anyway, those are your vulnerable groups to think about, but also in terms of emergency planning considerations, talked about sirens. So a real world example, during the Owensboro tornadoes in December in Kentucky, they hit, you'll hear about Mayfield and Dawson Springs. For me, that's Diocese of Owensboro. That agency was really small. They had 2 staff and then a couple of volunteers. And they were resettling, or in the middle of resettling about 200 Afghan evacuees. And the sirens started going off and they heard that the kids were shaking in fear because a siren to them means an air raid or an incoming attack. They had no idea what a tornado was, let alone what a tornado siren sounded like. So it had some psychological trauma for them, but then also understanding you've got a whole new hazard here that people need to be educated on. So if you have a large immigrant population, something to also think about in planning is that education piece. I grew up in the military. My dad was in the US Army for 30 years and didn't retire until I was 21. So my whole childhood. We moved to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, when I was about 3. And I remember it as something fun to do, where they brought all the families in because Fort Leavenworth is actually the field officer training school. So it rotates once a year, everybody who lives there, unless they're teaching. And Fort Leavenworth is called Prison City. So it has Leavenworth Prison, which is the federal prison, but it also has 2 or 3 other, like a state, max something out. There are a bunch of prisons in the vicinity of Leavenworth. And they taught us as little kids, it was this family fair and it was supposed to be fun, like McGruff the Crime Dog came, which I'm probably aging myself even mentioning him. But they fingerprinted us as a fun thing to do, but they fingerprinted us for a reason. And they taught us the differences in sirens, what a prison break siren sounded like versus a tornado siren. Now, living in the East, the fire siren will go off for the volunteer firefighters to come to the firehouse. To me, it's a prison break siren versus what in a tornado siren goes off, and I can still tell the difference. That's just what it is in my head. But if you're moving into a community and you don't know what the difference in those sirens are, there's kind of different responses to it. Go in the basement. I mean, they're both go inside and lock doors, but go in the basement versus not go in your basement. So teaching people ahead of time and including that in emergency planning. And evacuation, where to go, how to leave. I mentioned before, you ever seen the signs where this is your blue evacuation group, this is your purple? I have no idea what it means. I don't have any idea, and I'm in this field. It's information at the emergency planning level. And unless they disseminate it out, no one knows what to do. Also, understanding how to leave, like we mentioned before, but also understanding the risk of staying. As disasters incur and become more frequent, and especially as they hit the same area, we are seeing people stay, particularly the Gulf Coast. Might have lost everything in Katrina. They stayed during Ida. There was a lot who left, but there were a lot who stayed behind. Hard to even get a count of who, because you're thinking, all right, everybody's out. They listened to evacuation warnings. Like, no, I lost everything before. And when I came back, someone had ransacked what was left. So they're not going to leave this time. Or I lost my entire, I lost all my animals the last time I left. I'm staying here so I can keep an eye on them this time. I think that is going to grow as disasters become more and more prominent and more prevalent in the same areas. The risk of staying is still there, but we think the population who are staying is going to increase. That's where also mitigation plays a big role, is if we can mitigate the effects of that disaster to try to keep people as safe as they can in their homes, maybe it will help reduce the loss of life as the number of people stay behind increase. But they also have to know the risks, that there is not going to be any food, water, or emergency services, that no one's coming because you are under mandatory evacuation orders to leave. Our agencies in the South found people outside of Houma Thibodeau in Grand Isle, Louisiana, who hadn't eaten in a week, had a hot meal. They chose to stay. but most aid agencies were by the shelter population up near Baton Rouge. They weren't that far south. And that's a bigger issue for the BOED community to kind of get together and talk about how we can assist more or immediately after disaster, once the threat has gone away, to kind of come back in and be able to provide some of those additional services. There's a lot of issues in sheltering, especially with vulnerable populations. You have to look at cultural and religious considerations. If you know your population ahead of time, if you have a larger Muslim population, or there are some Christian sects as well that separate the men and women, having a curtain, having that prepared within the shelter plan ahead of time is really important. So to kind of ease people into it. But you're not going to know that unless you know the statistics of your area. Food as well, specific food that might be needed versus, everybody's getting a hamburger. Not everyone might be able to have that hamburger. So kind of taking that into account. Mobility devices. So you might have been able to get your elderly grandfather in the car, but you might not have been able to get his walker in the car, or his key, forgot a key. Having access to those additional medical equipment is always important to have on hand, and have those relationships at a time of who can give you that access. How are those people who are in wheelchairs going to take a shower within the shelter? Are there shower services, facilities available? All that handicapped language, taking all of that into account. And then medications. Something we can talk about Tonga in a little while is medication issues and access to refrigeration. Diabetics, keeping the insulin refrigerated. There's a few other chronic illnesses, being able to keep your medication in a safe place, but also a cool place. The final thing would be pets. So there's been a big push lately on pet sheltering, because people won't leave their house if they can't take their dog with them, but their dog's not allowed in the shelter. So different areas have started pet sheltering plans. I know Louisiana's one that has one, because it had been such a big issue about people staying home specifically for their pets. So being able to put your dog, your cat, I'm not sure how expansive the pet list goes, but being able to put them in a safe spot, know that they're being taken care of and that they're not stuck in the danger zone. So all these things have to be considered when really looking at emergency planning. And then returning and recovering. Where do you return to if the homes are gone? How do you recover if there isn't a distinct plan into how to funnel resources, particularly financial resources, back into the community? Do you have a community foundation who could do some grants? Do you have a faith-based council? So all the churches coming together to start thinking about how they're going to help, even if it's their own congregations, but how can they work together? Sorry, I know it's a lot of information I'm throwing at you. So a couple of tools and resources. CCSA, we actually have our own social vulnerability map. Let's see if I can pull this up. You are welcome to use. I will give your professor all these links. This is our social vulnerability map. And what it looks at is percentiles. So based on other areas, do you have a lower amount of multi-unit structures, or you have a higher amount of multi-unit structures? And this goes down to a little bit of a reference. You put the city in, you can put zip code. This is for Jefferson City. Take it a minute to load. But we can look at, just around.
Is this your own system?
This is CCSA's. We used open sources data, but it's public. You can.
So it was designed by you, but it's collecting data from other sources.
Census data, things like that. Mm-hmm.
but it's not shared. So it's just a way that you process that information, but it's not shared with other agencies.
We can. It's a Google site. We can absolutely share it. We use it, and so we share it amongst our network to use it in disaster programming. But like your students can access it. It's fine.
Okay, we'll talk about that. Thank you.
It's just US though. It's not a global list. So what we're looking at here, just for Jefferson City, couple flags, the below poverty line is really high. The amount of people living below the poverty threshold is pretty high. That's a 94th percentile. It's not a specific population number, but more percentile based. Unemployment's high. No high school diploma is pretty high. So when you look at that, are these people who are prepared for a disaster to hit? Probably not. Are they ones who could evacuate if needed to? Probably not. It also tells me that recovery, these are also people who probably aren't insured. So if their homes are hit, they might not be getting FEMA assistance. They could qualify, but they might not get full FEMA assistance. They might then be relying on VOED agencies, so voluntary organizations active in disaster. They might be relying on us to do rebuilds and repairs and things like that. That's what we look at. Let's see. No vehicle. That's another big thing. How are people in this area able to move around? And then some. Oh, can I take? Is it okay to take a question? Go ahead, Dylan.
So I'm actually from Jeff City, and a lot of the stuff does ring really true because in 2019 there was a flood that was then backed up by a tornado. And right next to the high school, there was a large amount of lower income housing that got absolutely destroyed. And what we saw that happened there was instead of, that housing being rebuilt, the high school, which is right next to it, just bought up the housing and they're turning it into, what are they turning it into? Parking lots and like some extended classrooms for the school. So just an interesting anecdote.
It is rezoning. It's like, where'd all those families go? Happens a lot post-disaster. You'll also see HUD has a program, Department of Housing and Urban Development has a program called CDBG, Community Development Block Grants. And it's to create, it's supposed to be to create more affordable housing. But what often happens in disaster is that affordable housing becomes a little unaffordable, and that there's actually disaster funding to come into neighborhoods like that to create more affordable housing, but it doesn't always get zoned the same way. And it's cities can have a tendency to say, well, this is a great time to think about where we want to move certain populations, or that's a great antidote to talk. And for me, immediate question is, where did they go? And are they with family? Are they with friends? Are they on the street? Where did that community actually end up? Do they end up the city planned for it, and that they're in other low-income housing area? It might be. But again, something to think about in disasters.
From what I understand, the population that I was specifically talking about, all of their properties got bought up by the school and through FEMA buyouts, I believe, as well. And then I believe they just spent the money on going to other parts of the city.
Interesting. Okay. So anyway, this is one tool that we use at CCSA and our local agencies use. They use it also for everyday program, not just disaster. Like, do we need to target a specific area within our large diocese to say, maybe do some canvassing and say, hey, are there other people in need? I mean, our motto is working to reduce poverty in America, and that is our mission. So using as kind of a social vulnerability indicators to look at that level when they can of detail in terms of the demographics of their community. Other piece here, single parent households is really high. What that also tells me is the ability to recover from the disaster is solely based on one income. If that one job is delayed at all restarting, or if that, maybe the factory they work in is destroyed, all of a sudden they're now on unemployment and looking for the FEMA recovery assistance. That only goes so far. What are the secondary impacts on that family because they don't have two income streams coming in, or because there is only one parent to watch the kids when they're in school, out of school, or the daycare didn't come back on. So it kind of, there's a lot of additional factors that like one statistic often leads to questions on. In mostly emergency planning, you wouldn't get down to this level of detail, but it can help you in understanding, especially the poverty indicators, understanding your community a bit more. The lack of vehicle, to me, is a big thing in emergency planning. And then the more minority population. This is actually average, but usually language is what I look at, not, I look at refugees and immigrants and language indicators to see is messaging going in the right way, and are people understanding where to go and what to do. Another piece for you, oh, there it is. CCSA, we actually do we have a disaster video library on different concepts. And one of this is considerations for special populations and disasters. Very similar to what I'm talking to you about now, that goes in a little more depth. It's a 23-minute, I think, video that you're more than welcome to access. It's on a YouTube page. And kind of invite you to look at that if you're interested in looking more in depth at these issues. And then with it is a participant guide, which has like identifying risk and identifying vulnerability, has some charts and things like that, which are really useful. One of the other things is this chart over here. We've done post-disaster in certain areas where percentage of counties affected in the diocese according to FEMA. So saying the FEMA says there's a national or federal disaster declaration comes through, and that county wasn't declared. We put it in red, it's low vulnerability. Or it was declared and most of the damage was in that county, would be getting that green, that high vulnerability. You look at average income, percentage of elderly population, below poverty. Elderly is a big piece in that if you look at Hurricane Katrina, about 70% of everyone who died was over the age of 60. So that elderly piece and making sure, again, access to the homebound and making sure transportation services, all of that kind of plays in together. See, immigrant populations, also a huge thing for us, making sure those populations are accessed. Okay, and then how you do it, but also who you should be around the table with to plan for these vulnerable groups. I talked a bit about VOADs. I'm not sure if that concept's been addressed yet, but so the voluntary organizations active in disaster. It's the domestic disaster agencies. There is a national VOAD. I'm our rep for Catholic Charities USA. We talk about kind of individual responses and things going on, recovery issues, but also we talk more, how are we going to work better together? We're identifying, like right now we identified a lot of agencies have a tendency to go more toward the urban area when the urban area as well as the rural are affected. Access to services, even for the voluntary agencies, hotels, things like that they need if they bring staff in, where those rural areas don't get as much assistance, and that's an issue. They're not able to recover as well. So we're trying to think of how could we, as VOAD groups, actually limit that more. How do we work together to spread services out in a better way? Those are issues we talk about national VOAD, but there's also state and then regional, sometimes even down to the local level VOADs. And getting them involved in planning is a great way of keeping the VOAD going. So they haven't had a disaster in a while. A lot of people, they can tend to fizzle. But if they're involved in planning, they can give their unique perspective into those local community issues. Some areas have what are called long-term recovery groups coming in after disasters. If they're pre-established, they can tell you who did they work with and what are the demographics of the community they worked with post-disaster. Or unmet needs committees, they're very similar groups. And then really, for me, getting the social service agencies around the table. We can tell you who we work with, who the populations are. Catholic churches, we can give you a homebound list because we have to take communion to the homebound. So there are ways of getting this info. Visiting nurse service is a huge one, getting them around the table, Meals on Wheels. Refugee resettlement agencies or migrant advocacy groups who they are actually the trusted people for a lot of our migrant agencies or these advocacy groups where you as an emergency planner might not get a whole lot of info out of some of these migrant communities. They can, and they can tell them it's okay to tell us what languages that you speak and tell us what your unique needs are. And then hospital systems, nursing homes, residential care facilities, most of them have their own emergency plans, but they're able to provide access medication. What if you are on a daily medication, you just got your 90 days filled and you left it behind? Your insurance isn't going to cover your next 90 days, or you have to have a waiver and it takes too long. Hospital systems can help out with that. Nursing homes can help out with equipment, or if they have extra beds for people who had to be transported, a whole hospital shuts down. There's plans in place to move those patients to another facility. All of that kind of has to play into your planning. So it's much more than just, this is how we think the community will respond, and more about understanding the details of that community. All that makes sense. Okay, last couple of minutes, I want to look at Tonga a little bit. I learned a lot looking this up and looking at some data. I didn't know Tonga has a universal healthcare system. That's a huge thing, because then as they're moving, or as you're moving population, or your population is affected, as long as that healthcare system has some sort of, you could almost share records. If it has just access, it lets access be much greater when you have that sort of system already in place by country. A few things though I was concerned with looking at the country. 60% of the population are considered obese. It's one of the most overweight countries in the world in terms of the rate. What that tells me is mobility issues, medical issues, hypertension, diabetes, heart disease will be higher. And those are specific conditions that you might need additional medical services available post-disaster. Mobility in terms of moving people. So island-based nation. Do you move everyone to one look off the smaller islands to the bigger islands? Do you get them off island completely and head to New Zealand? What do you do in terms of getting people to safety? 2/3 of that population is rural. And a lot of those rural homes are might not be able to withstand a tsunami, an earthquake. How do you get access to those rural areas, especially on island? Access issues can be huge, getting from one point to another. If it's the local small airport, which is usually a prop plane can get into, how do you get supplies in? How do you access people? Are there boats available to do such things? So just things to think about as you're looking at Tonga. And then 70% of the actual population who lives on island actually live on the biggest one. And I'm not even gonna try that, but enough there. That in itself, to me, there can be a tendency then to plan for the big island because most of your population's there and almost forget about your more rural areas and the smaller islands. So being aware is something we do here. We plan for the bigger area and we kind of forget about what about these smaller areas that might also be affected by a flood because where they are on a river or a floodplain or something like that. Their literacy rate is really, really high for a country. So that's great in that sharing information and getting information out there. It's less about the videos. You might be able to do the flyers and that sort of planning. But the big issue I saw was the property. 27% poverty rate. That this is actually from the government. Their statistics department recently did a multi-dimensional poverty by age group survey, which shows that they're looking at it, but multi-dimensional in terms of income, but also access to essential services. So you're poor because you have that low income, but also because you don't have a lot of access. And that can be, especially on an island-based population like this, if you have a smaller community, you might not have that access to healthcare, to multiple like stores to get food at, to jobs because of where you're living or where that location. So this to me is a concern. If I'm looking at a country, that 63% are actually vulnerable. So if they had a disaster, can they recover quickly? What if there's any sort of disruption in they're an agricultural based country. So what if there's a disruption in the growing season in their ability to get the crops in? If you're mostly subsistence, you're then also that vulnerable area, you're going to drop that down. The poor level is going to increase dramatically. But knowing that ahead of time, you can start doing planning on how to recover or how do you keep funds available so that you have money to help your population until they can get back on their feet after a disaster. And then the one other piece was they have a really small immigrant population. And they used to have a lot more Chinese on island, about 4,000, but then there were riots. So that population dropped to about 300 people. And that immigrant population can also get kind of lost in the shuffle, and keeping in mind that they do exist, that they are there and they are living there, and how are they also supported with some services.